Morning once again, and happy Sabbath. When I was a boy, after the time when I had to be taken to a nursery, so between the ages of 3 and 6, my parents were working at the theological seminary in Belgrade. Now this building it has everything in it, from kitchens to dorms, classrooms, chapel, and even an apartment for the dean, which was the dean of men, which was my dad, and my mom was the dean of women, and she was a teacher. So I grew up living in this building, surrounded by students, theology students. There were no children in the area. Some buildings a bit further down the street had some children, so I saw them sometimes. But I grew up with students, much older than me, probably 20 years older than me. And my best friends were the Power Rangers and the Ninja Turtles. So in my free time, I was either a ranger or a Ninja Turtle or a pirate or a knight or a warrior or samurai of any kind. And but that was interesting because my parents didn't buy me weapons. They didn't buy me weapons, but I had friends among the students who would buy me weapons. When they went to the market to buy groceries for the kitchen, the guys who were doing the supplies, or when they went about their own business, they would always sneak something forbidden from me, either a chocolate or a gun or a sword. And you could see me day in, day out, running around with a little short and a little vest tucked in the short, and then I had either a sword, or if not a sword, then a stick in the back of my vest, pretending to be a ninja or whatever I was that day. And there was one student in particular who was very fond of me, and he always gave me something forbidden. But I really liked him. And the problem was, my mom was teaching English then, and he was not very good. So I was just old enough to be able to recognize numbers. And I saw one day when she was marking the papers, the system we have back home is from 5 to 10. 5 is a fail, 10 is the best, and he got an 8, which is actually pretty good. But I thought that was not good enough, because he was my friend. So I took the red pen, and I drew a 10 over the 8, and then ran. I will spare you the details of the beating I got afterwards. But he was my friend, and as an act of gratitude for what I did for him, he bought me a big sword with sheath and everything. And this man ended up being the conference president. So that tells you something about the state of the church in Serbia. But as I was always imagining to be a warrior, and I was trying to fight imaginary enemies, sometimes even pretend that the students are my enemies and chase them with swords and sticks, I grew up and changed just ever so slightly. So when I read the Bible, I can identify with some people who I can see clearly that we're of the same temperament, the same mindset. And one person in particular that I would like us to think about today was this tall, bold, strong, muscular man who was standing on the left bank of the River Jordan this one very special day, looking over to the other side, holding his master's mantle in his hand. His forearm, strong, muscular forearm, was pulsating as he was squeezing this mantle. And he looked at it and remembered the first time he saw it. It was a few years before, and he was in his father's field, plowing the fields. Now, his father was a very wealthy man, and he had big fields. So it took 12 pairs of oxen to plow the fields if they were ever going to finish on time. So he was there with his fellow villagers, his father's workers, and he let 11 pairs of oxen go in front of him while he stayed in the back with the 12th. And the day was really hot, and the soil was really hard. But that's exactly what he liked about it, because it was making him stronger. He liked plowing, especially when the soil was hard. And as he was pressing on and applying the full weight of his body on the plow in order to move it just an inch, he felt something fell on him. And he shook it back, and he looked down, and he saw something big, heavy, and hairy. And he looked up on the road next to the field, and he saw a man walking by. he immediately knew who this man was. This man was also big, heavy, and hairy. And his description perfectly matched the description of a man very popular in his village. This man, with this very precise description, was Elijah, the Tishbite, the great prophet and miracle worker. His description was very famous and frequently retold. As a matter of fact, just the other night, the elders in the village were gathered around a fire, and they were telling the story of how this man, Elijah, the Tishbite, just recently defeated and humiliated 450 prophets of Baal by using fire from heaven. Not only that, but after that, he slaughtered them all over at Wadi Kishon. And now, this mighty man from the stories is walking down the road just next to him. As a matter of fact, it was him who threw this big, heavy, and hairy thing on him. It was his mantle. No further explanation was needed as to what this meant. He knew immediately what this meant. The prophet had chosen him. So he ran up to him, and as he was running, the prophet just glanced at him and continued walking. So he ran even faster, and when he caught up with him, he said, "Please, let me just go back and say goodbye to my parents, and then I'll follow you." The prophet looked at him and said, "Yeah, you can go back. For what have I done to you?" Oh, he understood what this meant. If he went back, what the prophet is saying is, if he went back, the mantle never fell on him. The election never happened. That means that him and the prophet have nothing in common. He understood what this meant. He showed sentimentality. He showed weakness. And the mighty, tough prophet who uses fire from heaven obviously wasn't impressed. So he decided to show him just how tough he can be. So he jumped back into the field, took a knife, and started slaughtering the beasts, slaughtering the oxen, 12 pairs of them, 24 beasts, known for their strength. He slaughtered them one at a time, one by one, slaughtered and stabbed them, sliced them, all the while imagining that he's slicing and stabbing the 450 prophets of Baal. The testosterone was boiling in his bald head, the abundance of which probably gave him the boldness in the first place. And he was slashing and cutting and stabbing, and blood was splashing everywhere. And when he was over, he stood and he looked at the field full of dead corpses, carcasses, full of blood. He was panting, gasping for air. And at that moment, it clicked in him. He realized, that's it. He's done living a normal life. He can never go back to it. He's done. He forgot about his parents, and instead, he took the yokes and broke them into pieces and made fire out of them and put the fire on and put the meat on the fire and roasted and cooked it and fed it to all the people. And when he was done, he jumped back on the road and ran over to the prophet who was standing at a distance and watching this gruesome spectacle. He came up to him, and without a word, the prophet just turned and continued walking. And as he followed him and walked, he was thinking to himself, he was wondering whether the prophet was finally impressed, whether he had proven himself worthy, whether Elijah now realized that he is tough enough. They walked in silence. Years passed since then, and he was following Elijah everywhere. He was witnessing him prophesy, he was witnessing him doing miracles, and all he ever wanted, all he ever wished, was to be as mighty, as powerful, as fierce, as tough, and as dangerous as his master. So he followed him every day, even today. But today was a different day. They were in Gilgal, and Elijah told him that the Lord has called him to go down to Bethel. But he said he shouldn't bother himself following him. He said, "Don't even worry about it. It's a long road. You should stay behind." Now this was strange. Elijah never asked him to stay behind, and the road was not that long. So he remembered that the first encounter they had was a test. So he realized that this must also be a test. and he must not show any signs of weakness, laziness, cowardness, of any of the like. So he exclaimed immediately, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. On their journey, they were walking in silence, and he sensed that something is different about today. Something big is about to happen today. Could it be that today was the day when his master will be taken away from him? The very thought of it just gave him cold sweat. He shook it away and continued walking, other than anxious. As they were walking, a group of the guild of prophets came out of Bethel, and they were walking with them, besides them. They were concerned and they were murmuring among themselves, and this was making him even more anxious. And finally, one of them walked up to him and said, "Did you know that today your master will be taken away from you?" He responded very upset, yes, I know. Now keep quiet." They left him and they continued walking. As they reached Bethel, Elijah spoke to him again, saying the exact same thing. He said, "The Lord has called me to go further down to Jericho. But you needn't worry following me. You should stay behind." He kindly asked him. He even said, "Please, stay behind." Oh, but he knew that this is the test. So he repeated his oath once again, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went further down towards Jericho. Another group of prophets, the so-called sons of prophets, came out of Jericho and met them again. They were walking by them, concerned, murmuring among themselves, and this was raising his anxiety to an uncomfortable height. He couldn't stand it anymore, and finally one of them decided to speak, and he knew already what he was going to say. And when he asked him, "Did you know that today is the day when the Lord will take your master away?" He said, yes, I know. Now be quiet. It's tense enough without you. I don't need you to be telling me this. Keep quiet. The man stopped and let the prophet and his disciple go on. When they reached Jericho, Elijah spoke to him again, informing him that the Lord has called him to go even further down. As a matter of fact, all the way down to the Jordan, the lowest point in the land, well below sea level. But he shouldn't worry following him. He should stay behind. Again, he exclaimed his oath without even waiting for Elijah to finish his sentence. "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they started going down, all the way down to the Jordan. Now the group of prophets, they decided to stay behind and watch the men from some distance, as if they knew that something is about to happen. Of course, they knew they were prophets after all. And now they were standing on the right bank of the river Jordan. On the other side was Aram, a wilderness, a hostile territory. And Elijah, he took off his mantle, this big, heavy, and hairy thing. He rolled it up, and then he hit the water with all his might, and the water started parting left and right. But then it continued parting left and right, and dry land appeared. At that moment, he realized, this man, Elijah, just parted the waters. That means that he is a prophet in the same rank as Moses, the greatest of all prophets. If Moses could part waters and now Elijah could part waters, that means that he's one of the greatest. And then he is about to be taken away from me. Oh, he couldn't stand this anymore. He was so anxious, he was shaking. And as they walked on the dry land, as soon as they crossed over, Elijah looked at him, saw how upset he was, and he said, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I'm taken away?" And he already had an answer. He was just waiting to be asked. He said, "A double portion of your spirit. Please, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." He was not asking to be greater than Elijah, to be twice as mighty. No. All he wanted was to be considered a firstborn when the inheritance of Elijah's spiritual gifts was being shared. The firstborn always got a double portion. That's all he asked. And the prophet looked at him and he said, "You know what? Let me give you another test. It's a very difficult thing you asked. So this is how we will do it. If you see me as I'm being taken away from you, it will be granted to you. If not, it will not. Another test? How many more? He couldn't stand this. And they continued walking. He was so anxious. He was so upset. He was so confused. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a chariot of fire appears with horses of fire and separates the two men. And behind the chariots of fire, a whirlwind starts. And the whirlwind starts spinning and spinning, and Elijah is being taken away, and he's looking and he's remembering that he must see it. He must see it in order to pass the test. But he couldn't see because the fire and the light was blinding him. And he was looking and he shouted out, "Father, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And before he knew it, it was all gone and he couldn't see anything anymore. It was gone. There was no smoke. There was no ashes. There was no wind. It was gone. And he was standing there, disappointed. He was so disappointed that he cried out once again and he tore his clothes in pieces. Not a little bit as the custom was, but completely, in two halves. He was standing there half naked, crying. And then he looked down and he saw this big, heavy, hairy thing on the ground. It was his master's mantle. He knew what to do with it. So he picked it up, rolled it up, and ran over to the river. And there he was, standing on the left bank of the Jordan now, holding his master's mantle in his hand, his forearm pulsating. And then he hit the water while crying out, where is God, the Lord of Elijah?" And the waters parted. Now, I may continue preaching this sermon, but I would like to propose to you a slightly different reading. At Newbold, they try to confuse us all the time. They try to teach us things that our mothers didn't teach us and that our grandmothers didn't sing to us. So they introduced us to some scholars who have been looking at this text, and they have realized that the text is slightly ambiguous. You see, even in the English translation, in most of English translations, the text says, "He struck the water and called out to the Lord. And when he also struck the water, they parted." Now, this construction in Hebrew is ambiguous. It could mean when he also struck the water, but it can also mean then he also struck the water, which means that he might have hit the waters twice. To avoid this confusion, when the Hebrews were translating their text, their sacred holy text, into Greek, they decided to add just a small detail here to eliminate the confusion. So what they said in the Septuagint is that he hit the waters and they didn't part. And then he called out to the Lord. So he hit the water and it didn't part. And there he was standing, half naked, sweating, panting, crying, realizing that he's failed. He was so eager to become as mighty, as fearful and powerful as fierce, as powerful as his master. And now there he was, and he failed. And it was at that point, at this lowest point in the valley of the Jordan, well below sea level, the lowest point in the land, the lowest point geographically and emotionally, that he cried out, "Where is God, the Lord of Elijah?" And then he struck the waters again, and they parted. This question made all the difference. And he was now crossing over. He was now on dry land. He passed the test. He realized in that very instant. He realized that Joshua, when he received the Spirit from Moses, he also had to cross this same river going in this same direction. That meant that he is now to Elijah what Joshua was to Moses. That's it. He passed the test. His name was Elisha. God saves. And from this lowest of points, he made his way up. He walked from the Jordan to Jericho, from Jericho to Bethel, and from Bethel he continued walking up to Mount Carmel. Dear friends, dear sisters and brothers, did you know that today your masters will be taken away from you? Our pastors will go home. They won't be around anymore. Our elders will go about their own business. Our Sabbath school teachers will depart from us. Our worship leaders won't be there. We will be alone, without our role models, without the people we look up to. And we will be asking ourselves the question, is this it? Have I passed the test? And I know that some of us, starting from me, are eager to inherit the power and the might of our favorite pastors, favorite elders, favorite preachers, favorite ministers of any kind. But let us not forget that the only question worth asking is, where is God? Where is God in all of this? Elisha indeed received a double portion of Elijah's spirit, but it wasn't at all what he imagined it to be. He must have questioned his choices quite a few times in his life. He must have asked, where is God, quite a few times in his life, because his ministry ended up being completely different than what he imagined it to be. You see, because instead of fire, death, destruction, and fear, his whole ministry, all his miracles, everything he did brought only life, healing, feeding, restoration. He was constantly involved in military affairs and matters of war, but never as a participant, always as a mere counselor. Even after his death, his bones continued to give back life. Yet, his most remarkable contribution, his most remarkable achievement, was the one that helped him pass Elijah's test in the first place. He was able to see the chariots of fire. He saw them when Elijah was being taken away. He saw them again when he was with his servant in the camp, surrounded by enemies in a crucial time in the war against the king of Aram. He was able to see God when no one else could. That was his most important contribution. He was able to see God. He knew where God was. God was with him. Dear friends, sisters, and brothers, your ministry for today starts today. Your ministry for today starts when I say amen. And in your ministries, God may not take you where you want to go. He may not use you for what you want to be used for. You may end up being confused and frustrated. You may end up asking yourself, have I passed the test? You may be confused and not being sure whether what you're doing is the right thing, or you might actually be sure that what you're doing is the wrong thing, but you don't know what to do instead. You might be confused, and you might think that you have failed. You might be feeling low, emotionally and geographically, and in every other sense. And in those low moments, let us not forget to ask ourselves the crucial question. Where is God? And where does He want me to be? And you may ask, okay, but how do we know where God is? Let us remember something that Elisha himself knew, but perhaps forgot this day because of all the tension and anxiety and stress. Perhaps he forgot. He forgot this episode from the life of his master, Elijah. This event when Elijah went up to Mount Horeb, also known as Sinai. This was the same mountain that Moses went up to when he was going to meet God himself, when God was about to pass by. So Elijah was on the same mountain, and Elijah went into the cave. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew says he went into the cave. It was the same cave, the same cleft in the rock that Moses was in when God passed by. And as he was in this cave, something was different, because when Moses was in this cave, a storm came, and a wind came, and an earthquake came, and a fire came. But then when Elijah was in the cave, a storm came and God was not in it. A wind came, God was not in it. An earthquake came, God was not in it. And a fire came and God was not in it. And then came a still, small voice. Or some translations say that the better rendition is the sound of sheer silence. And God was in it. In the case of Elijah, God was not where he expected him to be. In the case of Elisha, God was not where he expected him to be. He moved on. He was not in the fire. He was not in the destruction. He was in the healing. He was in the restoration. My dear friends, my sisters, and my brothers, your ministry starts today. And many of us may be eager to get on with our ministries. We may be eager to go out there with a double portion of God's Spirit and do miracles and do things in His name. We might be excited and we might be thinking that God is in the evangelistic campaigns. And God may or may not be in the evangelistic campaigns. We may think that God is in street preaching. He may or may not be in the street preaching. We may think that God is in the business of spreading books and literature, and He may or may not be in the business of spreading books and literature. We may think that God is in the health message and the health ministry, and He may or may not be in the health message and ministry. We may think that He is in the Pathfinder ministry, in the music ministry, in the social media ministry, in the small groups ministry, in the prayer ministry, in the charity ministry, in the community service ministry, and He may or may not be in all of these ministries. But what we need to do is ask ourselves, where is God? And where does He want me to be? And then listen to that still, small voice. Because if we cry out to the Lord, the only way to go is over to the other side and then up. If we're in that low place and we are confused, the only way to go is to cross Jordan and then continue walking up. The only question worth asking is, where is God? Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? Let us always listen to His still, small voice, because when we are able to hear His voice, we may be confident that we have passed the test. We may be confident that we are ready to receive a double portion of His Spirit. May God bless you. Amen.